Good morning. My name is Robin Miller, and I'm Corporate and Tax Counsel with Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. I'm here today to discuss Social Enterprise Part 1, Forming Appropriate Entities. Today's presentation, as you can tell, is Part 1 of a two-part series. The second part will take place on May 4th at 10 a.m. at the same location. Today, what we're going to cover is what a social enterprise is and the various different potential legal structures that are available to maximize the goals of the social enterprise activity. The second part is going to focus specifically on what a 501c3 nonprofit organization can do in the social enterprise space. Before we get started, let's talk a few minutes about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. Our mission is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits that serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals. We do this by matching eligible organizations with volunteer lawyers from leading corporations and law firms in the Atlanta area. And those lawyers are capable of assisting those clients with their business legal matters. If you'd like to become a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, if you're not already one, you need to meet the following eligibility requirements on this slide. So you need to be an existing 501c3 organization, located or serve the greater Atlanta area, serve low-income or disadvantaged individuals, and be unable to afford legal services. If you're interested in becoming a client of Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, please do visit us at our website, pbpatl.org. At that website, we have a request for legal assistance that you would complete online. In addition, as you're aware, we host these monthly webinars on various different legal topics. And there's one every month. It's usually the third Wednesday of the month, but it does vary. So please check our website and for our upcoming events. We also provide workshops through the Foundation Center every month and a variety of other opportunities. In addition, our website is full of all kinds of wonderful resources at our resource tab for just about every legal topic that a nonprofit needs to address. Slide 4 is our legal information. I need to spend just a minute on this. Today's presentation I will be providing general legal information. I will not be providing specific legal advice. If you are engaging in or considering engaging in a social enterprise and you are one of our clients, please contact us. If you are not, please do seek specific legal advice in your situation so that you can assure that you're doing it properly. Also, you'll note that there's a copyright notice on the slides and the information today. Let's now get into the subject. So what is social enterprise? And you'll see on this slide 5, I have two very specific definitions. And I don't really like to read from my slides, but I do want to really walk through these definitions so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about social enterprise. Because social enterprise has lots of different meanings out in the lingo around when people talk about it. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So social enterprises are revenue-generating businesses with a twist. They can be operated by a nonprofit or for-profit company, but they have two goals. One is to achieve a social, cultural, community, economic, or environmental outcome of some kind, and to earn revenue. On the surface, many social enterprises look and feel and even operate like a for-profit business. But if you look more deeply, what you'll find is that the defining characteristic of one of these businesses is a mission at the center of that business, and then with income generation playing an important supporting role. The second definition is also a great way to do it. It's a much shorter, but I wanted to go through the more detailed definition first. So a social enterprise is a revenue-generating business with primarily social objectives, where surpluses are reinvested for the purpose of the business, in the business or in the community. And instead of being driven by maximizing profits to the owners or investors, the profits are shared towards and used towards whatever their social, cultural, community, or economic environmental outcome they're trying to attain. So those are the two various definitions that we're going to start from. If you turn to slide 6, it sums up what we're really talking about. So basically, you've got market-based strategies to solve social problems. This company of whatever sort it is selling some kind of good or service. And it's in the business of doing this, selling this good or service. It can be either a nonprofit or a for-profit, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And it can be tax exempt or not. All of that depends upon the goal of the social enterprise as to what it should be, and that's the focus of the rest of our discussion. But before we get into what different kinds of options are available from a structural perspective, let's talk about a couple common social enterprises. I picked one that's more nationwide enterprise and one that is very local to Atlanta. Let's start with the Boot Campaign. So the Boot Campaign's mission is to promote patriotism in America and in our military community. And it's also to raise awareness about the unique challenges that our service members face during and post-service, as well as their families. What does the Boot Campaign do? Well, they sell combat boots at retail. They also sell merchandise that is apparel, various different apparel, that is mission-focused. So their apparel all has a Boot Campaign logo and slogans and things related to the Boot Campaign. What's also interesting to note is that the boots themselves all have a little tag on them that say they're part of the Boot Campaign. So it clearly identifies the boot as being part of this campaign, raising awareness about the issues that our service members or post-service members deal with. All the money that's raised through the organization goes towards assisting those individuals and their families. So they're selling a product, or they're selling products in this case, and it's benefiting a community, a broad community that is in need of assistance. Another example is Open Hands Good Measure Meals. Open Hand is an organization here in Atlanta. They provide meals to the poor and housebound, among other things. And they created a catering business called Good Measure Meals. It is a service that they offer. It is separate from Open Hand. They did it exactly the right way. They created a taxable subsidiary. They hired someone who had catering experience and business knowledge and a chef to run this business as a for-profit business. The way it is structured is that it is wholly owned by Open Hand, and all of the income generated, net profits, is delivered in a dividend. Well, not all of it, but some of it is delivered in a dividend up to Open Hand. This is a very specific structure. We're not actually going to get into the structure today in detail. We'll talk about that in part 2. But it's a really interesting and successful social enterprise for a 501c3 organization that knew that this activity is very much a for-profit activity. And so they structured it in such a way to make it successful and to benefit Open Hand. The next slide, what type of entity you should be, is kind of a busy slide. But I like it because it's a great summary slide. If you were to print one slide, this is a great slide to keep and have and look at as you think through these issues. So I think of it as the social enterprise spectrum. Now, it does not include all the different structures that are out there and available to organizations or entities that are trying to think about social enterprise activities. So if you want to conduct a social enterprise activity, this is sort of the spectrum, but there are some other options available that aren't listed here. So on the one side, you've got for-profit corporations or LLCs or various kinds of structures, and we're going to talk about that a little bit further in a minute. But the goal for the for-profit arena is to maximize profits. You know, the big issue here, of course, when you're dealing with social enterprise and a for-profit business is most for-profit businesses under their state law, the goal is to maximize shareholder and investor profits. And so if you're going to have a mission tied to that, where some of the money is going to go off to the mission, you've got an inherent conflict between the state law that requires maximization of profits and investor return and the idea that you're going to spend some of that money on a mission-based concern or issue. So that leads to the B Corp, which is really those vary. B Corp is technically a term that a nonprofit uses. There's that you can be certified as. I just used that because I didn't type in the whole word benefit corporation. So a benefit corporation, and they vary from state to state. Every state's law is different when it comes to for-profit corporations, benefit corporations, nonprofit corporations. And so I'm speaking very much in generalities, but you need to look at each state's law, and if your state even has a law that allows for this kind of corporation. So a benefit corporation has a different structure. It's sort of an in-between between a pure for-profit that's maximizing shareholder returns and a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, which is focused entirely on its mission and serving its mission. So a benefit corporation has that for-profit activity, selling goods or services, but it has a mission that it's trying to accomplish. So that's sort of true social enterprise structure. And then currently you cannot. I'm going to go into that a little further later on. The question was whether or not you can have a B or benefit corporation in Georgia, and currently you cannot, but I'm going to discuss that a little bit further in the presentation. A nonprofit 501c3 organization is sort of the opposite, the other end of the spectrum, which is that they're going to achieve a charitable goal. Their mission is accomplished through receiving donations, grants, sponsorships. They may have some additional revenue through their mission-based activities, but that is their focus. So we're going to break down each one of these, and we're going to talk about even a couple other structures so that you're aware of the various different options that are out there. Not all of these exist in Georgia, and so we'll talk about that as well. Turning now to for-profit businesses from a social enterprise perspective. So there's different types, but at base, these are businesses that are selling goods and services. So they can be a sole proprietorship, they can be a partnership, which sometimes is considered an S Corp, and I'm mixing terms here, very common terms that you might hear. Some of them are tax terms and some of them are corporate terms, but these are just the common words that you're going to hear out there for different options. But you should talk to a corporate attorney about setting up a proper company, or you can go to the Georgia Secretary of State's website as a good starting point as well. They have lots of good information on the various different for-profit corporations that you can establish. A standard corporation or a C Corp or a limited liability company, and those are all various different options that are out there. These act like a regular business. They sell products or services, but in this case, if it's a social enterprise, they're also telling the public, hey, we're going to give some or all of our net profits towards some social mission or goal. I want to talk about two of the perhaps the oldest, most recognized social enterprise businesses out there that have been around for quite a long time. I think whether or not they're the best is a different issue, but these are just some standard ones that really created the buzz around social enterprise and started the whole movement. The first is Newman's Own. Newman's Own is actually a privately held for-profit business. It's a food company. They make and sell a variety of food products. They give 100% of their after-tax profits from the sale of their products to the Newman's Own Foundation, which is a private foundation charity. And then that private foundation distributes its income to various different other charities. Tom's Shoes is another one I want to mention. And Tom's Shoes is really interesting because they're not just shoes anymore. I think a lot of people just think of them as shoes. But they started out as a company that designs and sells shoes based on the Argentine Alpargata design. And the whole idea behind Tom's Shoe is that they sell a pair of shoes, and a new pair of shoes is also given to an impoverished child. In addition to selling shoes, they also now sell eyewear, and part of the profit from the eyewear is used to save or restore eyesight for people in developing countries. They also added Tom's Roasting, which involves coffee, and they have a mission associated with the coffee. which includes providing safe drinking water for people around the world. And then in 2015, they began a bag collection, and that addresses the needs of maternal health. So each one of their lines of products has a specific mission associated with it. Again, very much a for-profit business, but they also have a mission of doing good. It's an interesting scenario because they aren't in one of these benefit corporations, and they do have this issue of maximizing shareholder value. Now, in Newman's Own, it's privately held, so that means the people that are investing understand from the very beginning how the operation is working, and it is actually only owned by a few people. So the critical thing here, of course, is that they have capital and funding. They have owners and investors, and their income comes from the sale of their goods and services. So the owners and investors expect something in return normally in a normal for-profit business. But in this case, they understand that they might not get as much back. And in the case of Newman's, they don't get any back. But they understood that from the very beginning. Now, some people might argue, especially in the case of Tom's Shoes, that they make more money and sell more products because of their mission. So even though their shareholders or investors might not get as much back per item sold, they sell far more items as a result of that mission. And so they end up doing very well for their investors or their shareholders, even though they're not fully maximizing their profits. And so there's an argument to be made for the fact that this entity is doing good, generates more revenue for the company. Overall, they have to pay income taxes on the income that they make, and that's going to depend on whichever corporate structure they have taken on in the for-profit business arena. This is a great structure for a general business that's really selling goods or services, but that wants to give back. So they need to, of course, make sure that they're not going to be sued by not maximizing shareholder profits and giving some of it to this mission or putting it towards a mission. But if you're at base specifically just selling goods or services and then giving money towards or giving product towards some other goal, a pure for-profit business may be the way to go. Another area I want to talk about, and I only want to mention this briefly because it really did not take off as well as people thought, which is a low-profit limited liability company, or an L3C. It's only a few states that have this law. The idea was really behind, it was sort of making a hybrid business that combined for-profit and nonprofit elements with socially beneficial activities. It's run like a for-profit business where, of course, profits are distributed, there's flexibility in ownership, and it has limited liability for its members. And through the tax structure, it can act as a pass-through entity, which is something you need to consider depending on who it's passing through to. But really the purpose of L3C was to enable donations from private foundations as a program-related investment. So private foundations have to give away a certain amount of their income every year, and unless they do, and then there's provisions for giving money as a program-related investment. And so the idea was these structures promoted program-related investments. But there were other ways to do this without creating this kind of entity, and so very few states adopted it. Moving on to the more common public benefit corporations, or B Corps, as I mentioned before. So this was on the summary slide. It's the next best option for a for-profit social enterprise. A lot of states are enacting public benefit corporation laws so that for-profits can avoid litigation if they want to do social good. Georgia, actually, we had a statute introduced to the 2016 legislature, but unfortunately it never made it out of committee this year. So hopefully next year it will make it out of committee and become law. There's actually 31 states that have some form of public benefit corporation statute. And there's 5 states that have legislation pending. It's important to have that kind of legislation at this point because Georgia can't recognize that entity in our state because we don't have that kind of statute. So when those types of entities want to do business in Georgia, it makes it more complicated because we don't have a similar statute. So let's talk for a few minutes about what it is and what the requirements are, and understand that this law in particular varies somewhat state by state. So you really have to look at each state's law. The legislation that was proposed for Georgia was very broad, one of the broadest statutes proposed to allow for freedom of choosing what kind of social impact you wanted to have. But generally, it provides clarity to the directors and officers of their fiduciary duty. And their fiduciary duty includes the creation of a public benefit consideration and non-financial interests, which is different from your standard for-profit business. So the general requirements, you have to have a corporate purpose to create a material positive impact on society and the environment. Now, the Georgia statute did not require and the environment, but it included the opportunity to benefit the environment, but it didn't require it. They are required to consider the impact of their decisions not only on shareholders, but also on their workers and their community and this environment as a whole, not specifically environmental issues. They are required to make an annual benefit report available to the public. Now, some states also require that they assess their overall social and environmental performance against a third party. And that's part of what the B Corp does, that nonprofit corporation that certifies benefit corporations. There's a whole lengthy process that you have to go through to be approved. And in that case, you do have to assess your social performance against a standard. The Georgia proposed legislation did not require that third-party standard requirement. It simply said that you do have to provide a report to show that you are in fact engaging in and trying to accomplish your social mission as you laid out. So that's a public benefit corporation. Georgia doesn't currently have it. We hope they will, but other states do, and it is a great way in which to marry the two and have a social enterprise effective structure, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I want to very briefly mention social purpose corporations because a couple states have those, not very many. Actually, the Georgia proposed law encompassed the idea of a social purpose corporation, so you wouldn't need a separate statute for that. But it also provides clarity to directors and officers that their fiduciary duty includes considering social or environmental issues in decision making and not only relying on maximizing goals. There's actually only 4 states that have some form of social purpose corporation statute. Again, those vary from state to state, and some public benefit corporation statutes may encompass the idea of a social issue being addressed in addition to environmental. The next slide is really a great slide. It's courtesy of SOENT law, which I really appreciate, or social enterprise law, sort of shortened. It gives you kind of a helpful picture about sort of where the landscape is when it comes to entities in the social enterprise sphere. You'll see the most common is the public benefit corporation. Again, each one may be different from state to state. But the reason there's so many different versions and different types of entities is because, again, each state is very different. So, but the most common here has 24 benefit corporations. That's all that they have in that state. Then there's some that also have a benefit and a social purpose. Then there's some that have social purpose only. And you can see the different variations. So each state kind of has designed its own corporation and structures. It's definitely easier to conduct business if you have a public, at this point, most of the states have public benefit corporations. So hopefully Georgia will soon enact its own statute. So those are the various different kinds of sort of for-profit models that are out there, because even a public benefit corporation is still generally a for-profit model, paying income tax. treating its employees from a for-profit perspective all the same, no volunteers, no benefits. And if you go back to that summary slide that I showed you earlier, it walks you through all those various comparisons on workers, goals, investors, and other important things that you need to think about when you're setting up one of these entities. So now I'd like to turn to sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, which is Section 501c3 nonprofit corporations. These are typically charities or educational organizations, churches, hospitals, any organization that meets the mission under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. And I want to walk through sort of the nonprofit piece of it, and then we're going to walk through the 501c3 piece of it, because it's two different things. You get your nonprofit, you're a nonprofit corporation under the state law, and then your 501c3 status is through the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level. So generally, a nonprofit corporation exists for the benefit of the public. It's this next bullet is a really important bullet. It's directed and managed by the directors of the corporation. There are no owners. You may have members, and the members might choose the directors, and the members may have a few other opportunities for voting on various different things depending on the structure of the nonprofit. But generally, you find that the members are simply voting on the directors and maybe the officers, and very only extremely high-level issues, the overall direction of the corporation, and it varies from state to state. But in Georgia, it can be limited to simply voting for the directors. But it's the directors who direct and manage the organization, and they direct the officers to how to operate the organization. And there's no profits that are distributed. All of the income that is generated goes back into the organization to further meet its mission. And then its mission, as we talked about before, it has to be under that 501c3 category. So it's got to operate for the benefit of a broad community, and it has to comply with one of those 501c3 purposes. It's really important to understand that once income it goes into a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, it belongs to the public. And it never gets redistributed out to anyone who has contributed that money or any kind of member or shareholder or investor. If that organization dissolves, the income from any of the assets and income that still exists in that organization must be distributed to another 501c3 nonprofit corporation. So as you can see, this is very different from the other structures we were talking about. The goal here is not to sell products or services. The goal is to serve the mission. Turning now to the next slide, I want to talk about briefly what it is to be a 501c3 organization. So to meet the test of a 501c3 organization, you must be organized and operated. You'll notice exclusively is in parentheses, or quotes, which I'll explain in a minute, but you must be organized and operated exclusively for exempt purposes. So organized means you have to be set up to meet the requirements of Section 501c3, all the things that I just talked about on the previous slide. And that has to be in your articles and in your bylaws. So when you apply for 501c3 status, you have to submit your articles and bylaws to prove that you are organized as a 501c3 organization. Exclusively is not really true. It has to be primarily operated for exempt purposes. By the way, I could spend a long period of time discussing this test and these rules. It's a whole nother subject, and so I'm not going to go into it in that level of detail. We do have other webcasts on our website that do cover this and far more in depth than I'm going to go into today. So if you have any questions about that, you can go to some of our other webcasts. And then it's for our exempt purposes. So the exempt purposes you've identified, whether it be charitable, religious, educational, or so on, under the code section. Because 501c3 nonprofit organizations have the benefit that donors can take a tax deduction by giving, for when they give money or donate to the organization, that's a great privilege for the 501c3 organization. Well, with that privilege comes responsibilities and limitations. And so real briefly, there's some limitations that a 501c3 has. One is that they cannot participate in political activities. They cannot participate in substantial lobbying activities. They cannot have private inurement, which is an excess benefit to an insider. And they cannot have substantial private benefit. So obviously there's some limitations associated with that. So now you're really starting to see that 501c3s are really quite different from the other structures we were talking about. So let's spend a couple of minutes on the considerations for 501c3s conducting social enterprise activities. Well, social enterprise activities involve the sale of goods or services that may or may not be in furtherance of the C3's actual charitable purpose or mission. And it's important to understand that just because you might be selling a product or service and that income generated from that is going back into the organization for its mission, does not make that activity in furtherance of its mission. So if you're selling phones and your mission is working with disabled individuals, and these phones are just regular everyday phones, then that sale of a phone is not related to your mission. And even though the sale of the phone and the money generated from the sale of the phone might be helping to serve your mission, it's an unrelated activity. And under the 501c3 operational test, an organization's activities must further its charitable purposes. Now we talked about exclusively, but primarily it must further the organization's charitable purposes. So there's some really significant potential consequences for C3s engaging in those kinds of business activities that are not in furtherance of its mission. And that can include loss of tax exemption. There are definitely ways C3s can engage in social enterprise activities. The examples I gave at the beginning of the session, the boot campaign is doing it well. They're selling boots, but it's clearly in furtherance of its mission and making people aware of the circumstances and needs of our service members and post-service members. And then there's the way Open Hand has created a taxable for-profit subsidiary to generate income for them as well, and they've set it up properly to do so. So there are ways to engage. There's other options, and we will talk about that in part 2, so that we'll spend an extensive amount of time talking through the various ways that C3s can do that. But they have to do it carefully. So they can the activity must either be related to their mission, like in the boot campaign. The activity must be an exception to the unrelated business income rules. The unrelated activity must be very small as a percentage of its activities, and or they have to do it through another entity. So those are generally the various different options that are available to C3s in terms of operating some kind of social enterprise activity where they're selling goods or services in connection with their operations. Are there any questions so far? Okay. So in part 2, we're going to talk about what C3s can specifically do with conjunction with social enterprise. But I'd like to spend a minute summarizing what we've talked about today. And that is there are various different corporate structures for conducting social enterprise activities. Different states have different structures as well. But you need to think really about these 4 things when considering a structure, a corporate structure, to best serve your social enterprise goals. And that is, what are the goals and objectives of the social enterprise? What is that social enterprise trying to accomplish? And then think about which structure might best fit that goal. Then second, what are your funding sources and who are your owners? And what is it that they want back and out of this social enterprise activity? Because that will direct you in determining which entity is most appropriate. Finally, what is the messaging you want to present? Well, almost finally, what is the messaging you want to present? How are you trying to message your social enterprise and what are your goals? And those connect. But depending on your messaging, you may choose a different structure as well. And then finally, the overall outcomes you're trying to achieve. Depending on your overall outcomes, you may choose a different structure because it may give you the option to achieve your goal in a more effective way. So as you think through what kind of social enterprise entity you should have. You really need to analyze what is it that you're trying to accomplish and what are your goals. Part 2 of this presentation involving social enterprise will take place once again May 4th at 10 a.m. I look forward to seeing you there.
The question is, what are the governance issues that present themselves?
The question is, what are the governance issues involved when discussing these various entities that I've discussed? Well, each entity has its own governance issue because each one is organized and operated very differently. On the 501c3 spectrum, as I mentioned, you have a board of directors and you might have members, and they direct the members direct the board, choose the board of directors, and the directors choose the officers. If you've got a limited liability company, it depends on what your operating agreement says and how it's going to be operated and structured. If you have a C corporation, then you've got shareholders and you have to have shareholder meetings, an annual meeting, and they have rights inherent in the C corporation. So it depends entirely on the structure. And the benefit corporation structure that Georgia had introduced, and I'm most familiar with that. It's not law, but it's what I'm most familiar with. It was structured very much like a C corporation, where you've got a standard corporation where you've got shareholders, and then they have certain rights under the law to participate in the annual meeting. They have a right also to get that benefit annual report about what the organization is doing socially or environmentally or in any other way that they were benefiting the public. And so they have the right to vote for various different aspects of the corporation's activities. Open Hand is a 501c3 organization. And Good Measure Meals is a wholly owned taxable subsidiary of Open Hand. Another question? Looks like we have another question coming. Yes. Yeah, so what that means is that the entity that owns, so in a limited liability company, you can have a partnership type structure where essentially you have the owners, instead of the corporation paying taxes, the income from that entity is passed on to the owners, and the owners are responsible for paying the taxes associated with that entity. In the case of a 501c3 organization, if a 501c3 nonprofit corporation wholly owns an entity, it can be disregarded for tax purposes. So it can take on the 501c3 aspects or attributes. But if it's doing a for-profit business activity, if it is disregarded, then the activity might as well just be done in the 501c3 entity. And so that's why when I refer to Good Measure Meals, it's a taxable subsidiary. So it is a for-profit business that is separate and not disregarded. And the low-profit limited liability company, in many cases, it might make sense to have it pass through to the entity because of the nature of what they're doing. May be more charitable, but it also depends on who actually owns that business. Well, that's exactly what we were just discussing, is that those are three different options for conducting a social enterprise activity. You just need to be cognizant of the benefits and restrictions of each structure, which is what I've just been discussing today. The question was whether Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta helps nonprofits set up for-profit structures, and we do not assure our clients that we can assist them when they set up a for-profit business. And that's something very important to understand, because we have a mission of serving 501c3 nonprofit corporations. We do not assist our those entities when they set up a for-profit business in those operations. So for instance, Open Hand is not a client, but if they were, we would not assist Good Measure Meals in its operations and provide legal advice or legal services to that entity. Hopefully that helps to explain that. Yes, we would absolutely provide advice about whether or not it makes sense to establish a for-profit business when we're talking to a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, because we want to assist our clients to ensure and protect their 501c3 status so that they can continue to be successful in their mission and operations. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.